Good afternoon to all. Today we are going to have the third session on Masterclass series of P.K. Das Institute of Medical Sciences. Today's topic is clinical decision making. It may appear very simple for many of us because we diagnose disease by pattern recognition. For example, a patient comes with a fever, cough, some headache, and a running nose. There is no confusion. We immediately make a diagnosis of common cold or influenza. In the present era of COVID, if there is some hypoxemia also, our diagnosis is COVID. So for a common man, it appears very simple. That is, the doctors are seeing cases, they are diagnosing. Just that is why many people are telling doctor on the kandamadi, just see me. But in certain complex cases, this is not possible. We have to go by the diagnosis has to be there, the severity of the disease has to be assessed, and management decision has to be taken. For that, an analytical approach is required. And here comes the evidence-based medicine. We have to go by the evidences for the just and the appropriate care of the patients. In order to discuss this, we have got none other than Professor Sudhindra Ghosh. He was the Professor of Pulmonology at the Government Medical College, Trivandrum. He was Principal of Government Medical College, Thrissur. And now he is working as Professor of Pulmonology at Gokulam Medical College. He's had a lot of publications to his credit, and he has got recently been awarded Roberta Habola International Award for the best research on asthma. And he has been given awards by the APCCM, and he is Fellow of International Clinical Epidemiology. And I will not stand between you and Professor Sudhindra Ghosh, sir. Over to sir.
So, good evening. First of all, let me thank Professor Andrews and also the authorities of P.K. Das Memorial Medical College Hospital for arranging such an opportunity and also permitting me to interact with your students as well as the guest faculties. And also thank once again Dr. Andrews for remembering me at this occasion and also for permitting me to choose this topic for the benefit of our young colleagues. As you can see, decision, Professor Andrews said, most of the decisions are made without much difficulty, but you may come across certain situations, then decision making may not be that easy. As you can see, during the pandemic, during the first wave of pandemic, we have only intervention that is available is the social vaccine. So people have to make a decision regarding whether to use the mask or not. So adherence to mask is very important because people realize the decision to wear the mask is important because that will help them from getting the infection as well as prevent infection. When the first surge flattened and the vaccine became available, then people are confused about whether to take vaccine or go for the viral infection, which is best. So decision taking was very difficult at that point in time. There was lot of hesitancy in taking the vaccine that we have seen. But during the second wave, when the surge occurred, decision to get vaccinated became the most prominent one because people realized that there are a lot of uncertainty regarding the availability of appropriate care when they get a severe infection. So decision making is very important, and this decision can be at community level, patient level, or at the hospital level. Next slide. Slide, please.
Can't see the slides.
Can't see. Okay, thank you. So decision analysis and making decision in clinical medicine. Next slide, please. So decision making is the cognitive process resulting in the selection of a course of action among several alternative possibilities. And we know that advances in genomics and other omic technologies have ushered in a new era, variably called personalized or precision medicine, which takes into account individual genetic and other sources of variability in disease treatment and prevention. Next, please. By looking at this slide, you realize the complexity that is in healthcare design. You can see to achieve the desired health status, we should know. That's an slide, please.
Ask all others to mute the audio. All the participants.
Okay, fine. So there are many factors that one has to take into consideration when making healthcare decisions. We want our patient to get the desired health status. If that is only possible if we have the available resources as well as the local expertise. If those two things are available, then the most important thing is what are the important parameters one has to consider. For example, in this case, we should know the current status of the patient. We should also know the current functional status of the patient. Along with that, it is very important that we should have some information about the culture of the patient, his religious belief, his social engagement, his friends, family, work, and ethics. Because, to get vaccinated or not, that is a decision, difficult decision initially. Now it became more easy because adherence has improved a lot. But even for getting the vaccination, all these factors are very important, and the patient has to consult many. If suppose the patient has got an allergic problem, definitely he or she will ask me, doctor, can I get the vaccination? So there are many parameters one has to consider to make the appropriate decision. Next, please. So this brings us the introduction of evidence-based approach in clinical practice. Medicine is a science of uncertainty and an art of problem. That is our Indian and David Sackett initiated
ആൾക്കാരെ സംസാരിക്കുന്നുണ്ടോ? ആൾക്കാരെ സംസാരിക്കുമ്പോഴാണോ?
സാറിന്റെ സൈഡിൽ സാറിന്റെ സൈഡിൽ സാറിന്റെ
ഇവിടെ അൺമ്യൂട്ട് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റത്തില്ലേ?
Yeah, now it is okay.
ശരി.
Show me the slide.
Next slide. Next. സർവീട്ടാണ്
Slide is-
ആണ് പക്ഷെ മെഡിക്കൽ അടുത്താണല്ലോ കോടതി.
Slide is not visible. Okay, fine. So we start the first slide, that is introduction of EBM approach in clinical practice. As you can see, medicine is a science of uncertainty and an art of probability. That is how William Osler applied medicine as he practiced it at the turn of the last century. Later, Alvin Feinstein and David Sackett initiated the clinical epidemiology movement, which translated epidemiological analytic methods to physician decision making at bedside. In the 1990s, Robert Gatt, a physician at the McMaster University, first described the term evidence-based medicine. So what is evidence-based medicine? By definition, it is the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. Next, please. Evidence-based medicine has further refined. Now we have come across the precision medicine and personalized medicine at our practicing conditions or situations. What is precision medicine? Precision medicine is a science where a new wave of evidence-based medicine, where targeted therapies based on molecular diagnostics is applied. While personalized medicine is a practice where managing a patient's care more holistically, where we take into consideration prevention and treatment based on environment, lifestyle, and genes. This is summarized the previous slide. Next, please. Definition of related EBM comes from Al-Razi, who was an Islamic physician. He observed and documented what happens to the patient who receives the treatment and those who are not receiving it. Later, James Lind was a Scottish doctor. By conducting one of the first ever clinical trials, he developed the theory that citrus fruit can cure scurvy. Then Pierre Louis Charles, who was a French physician, who developed the numerical method, which formed the path for evidence-based medicine and which was the forerunner of epidemiology and the modern clinical trial. Next was, you go back to the previous slide, please. Yeah, same slide, yeah. Then we have Sir Austin Bradford Hill, who was a biostatistician from the UK, who was behind the streptomycin trial and also the lung cancer rationale. His papers supported that lung cancer is definitely related to cigarette smoking. And also he proved with his colleague, when patients suffering from pulmonary tuberculosis was treated with streptomycin in combination with PAS, gave better outcome than getting PAS alone or streptomycin alone. And later, Alvin Feinstein, who was an American clinician, researcher, and epidemiologist, who made a significant impact on the clinical investigation and is currently regarded as the father of modern clinical epidemiology, and his publication of Efficiency, Effectiveness in Medicine from the Department of Biostatics and Clinical Epidemiology is a very important document for all the physician to follow. Next slide, please. This brings us to the evidence-based analytic approach at bedside by David Sackett. He created the evidence cart, which he used during the bedside rounds. He was able to change about 1/3 of medical decision within a short time after research, literature review, and evidence collection. How did he do that? He had, next slide, please. So he developed 5 steps in the evidence-based clinical practice. The first step in that was to ask a question regarding the illness of your patient. Second step was, once the question is framed with reference to the patient's problem, one has to go back to the library and search for evidence with reference to the condition of the patient and its management. Once the evidence is collected in step 3, you have to evaluate the available evidence by appraising it. Once the appraised evidence is with you, in step 4, you apply the appraised information in combination with the clinical experience, and this is followed by step 5, when you evaluate the outcome and see how much it differed from the usual clinical practice. Next. In this context, it's worth remembering the contribution of Professor Archibald Cochrane. He was a British researcher. Way back in 1979, he wrote, "It is surely a great criticism of our profession that we have not organized a critical summary by specialty or subspecialty wise, adapted periodically of all relevant randomized control trial." And we should remember that the Cochrane collaboration is named in honor of Archie Cochrane. Next, please. So this brings us to decision making in evidence-based medicine. It is an approach to teaching the practice of medicine and improving decisions by individual physicians about individual patients. So the aim of evidence-based medicine is to integrate the clinician, the values of the patient, and best available scientific information so as to guide decision making about clinical management. Next, please. So this Venn diagram summarizes the important component of EBM, that is clinical expertise, patient preferences, as well as research evidence, which is critically appraised. Next, please. We know we make decisions under the so teaching the art and science of medicine, the type of decision under certainty, uncertainty, and the complexity of in clinical decision making, and how artificial intelligence and machine learning programs will help us to reduce this uncertainty will be described by the subsequent slides. Next, please.
Next.
So teaching the science and art of medicine is an important consideration for those entrusted with the training the next generation of physicians. Using evidence-based approach definitely helps in accurate and appropriate integration of the research evidence into patient care. EBM also requires precision, attention, and humility. EBM is associated with a deliberate, thoughtful, and mentored experience. Next, please. So when we make a decision under uncertainty, there are many ways we can make the decision. The first one is the knowledge-guided decision. Second one is the rational decision or rule-guided decision, or many times we will be going for intuition-guided decision. Next, please. So complexity of clinical decision making. Medical decision making is complex because it involves physician's knowledge, his experience, and his judgment. Number 2, there is problems with validity and reliability of the information that is available to us at the bedside. There are risks to the patient, outcome preferences, and perspective which we have to consider. And we should realize that most of the times, the information that is available to us is imperfect information with high levels of uncertainty, probably because of the biological variation among our patients, or maybe because of the measurement errors that may occur when we evaluate the patient. So, to improve the accuracy of medical decision making and to reduce the error that can occur, we may require application of probabilistic reasoning as well as technology-based analytic reasoning. Next, please. Slide. Slide is not seen. Next slide, please. Dr. Andrews, slide is not seen.
രണ്ടും ഉണ്ടല്ലേ കമ്പ്യൂട്ടർ
കാണുന്നുണ്ടോ സാറേ?
സ്ലൈഡ് കാണുന്നില്ല.
ഇപ്പോഴോ ഇപ്പോഴോ ഒന്ന് ഫുൾ സ്ക്രീൻ ആക്കി സാർ ഇപ്പൊ കാണുന്നുണ്ടോ?
ഇല്ല.
നെക്സ്റ്റ് സ്ലൈഡ് എടുത്തേ. ഇപ്പോഴോ സാർ?
ഇല്ല.
ഒന്നുകൂടെ ഷെയർ ഒന്ന് ചെയ്ത് നോക്കി.
Yeah, but now it is visible. Yeah, good. Okay, enlarge it.
വലിയ പ്രശ്നം.
Our decision-making capability, at present, we can depend artificial intelligence as well as machine learning. How this reasoning, slide not visible. Slide കാണാൻ വയ്യ.
Sir.
Yeah, fine. Now it is visible.
Okay.
Enlarge it. Okay.
Enlarge it.
So now there. How artificial intelligence and machine learning programs help us. Artificial intelligence and machine programs usually use categorical or deterministic reasoning at one extreme and probabilistic reasoning or evidential reasoning at the other. The prototype of categorical reasoning is flowchart in artificial intelligence, and decision analysis prototype is the probabilistic reasoning. To demonstrate expertise in medical consultation, artificial intelligence and machine learning programs will have to use a judicious combination of categorical and probabilistic reasoning. Categorical reasoning is essential to establish a sufficiently narrow context. Once that narrow context is created, then probabilistic reasoning will make comparison among different hypotheses that we generate and eventually recommend the appropriate therapy. That is what is seen as the diagrammatic representation, the other side. Next, please. So, for example, if you are making a clinical decision to manage a patient suffering from lung cancer, you have a lot of uncertainty with reference to the outcome, because we don't know which type of therapy that will give the maximum benefit to this patient, because we have immunotherapy, radiation therapy, chemotherapy, and surgery. Out of these different types of alternative therapies that is available, which one is the best for that particular care? whatever may be the type of cancer, these type of therapies are currently being used. You may use one or the other or combination of all. So in that difficult situation, the most common algorithms used by this machine learning and artificial intelligence include the Monte Carlo simulation, the Bayesian inference, Dempster-Shafer theory, implies probability, fuzzy logic, and rough classification. These are the black box that we may be using under these programs. Next, please. Now let us consider the outcomes of our usual prescription. So for example, if there is a patient who is having bronchial asthma, you're tempted to give him a bronchodilator. Usually, previously, most commonly prescribed is the salbutamol. What happens to the patient once he or she takes this salbutamol for the bronchoconstriction? You will see that there may be a group of patients who may develop toxic effect of salbutamol at the same time with the bronchodilation. There may be another group where the patient may not develop any side effects, but there is no good effects as well. Maybe the red one. In those people, the drug may produce no bronchial dilatation, but only toxic effect, namely the tremor. Majority of the patients we expect they may get a bronchodilation without much side effects. So this is what usually happens. And to gain the maximum benefit and to reduce the minimal side effects, you have to identify the phenotype of the patient population, the genotype of the patient population, and the endotype of the patient population. So this combination and permutation, once you use, generally you will be able to prescribe the most appropriate therapy for your patient so that all the patient may get the expected bronchodilation. Next, please. Now let us review some of these slides where how to collect the evidence to make modification of the medical decisions. We should know what data to be collected, what questions we need to be addressed at the bedside, and what type of cognitive shortcuts are available to us to make the decisions. And if you use those cognitive shortcuts, what are the common cognitive errors that can happen? And we should also know how to frame a background question as well as a foreground question, because when you are appraising available evidence, you have to search for the evidence, and framing these questions are very important. That is what we are going to discuss in the subsequent slides. Next slide, please. So we should realize that evidence-based decision making is a process of integration of clinical data for decreasing the diagnostic uncertainty, to reduce the risk to patient, avoid unnecessary cost. That is very important, that you have to remember. Very important, that is avoiding unnecessary cost. So evidence-based decision making helps in deciding what information to gather, which test to order, how to interpret and integrate the test information once the results are available to us, and how to draw diagnostic conclusions based on which what type of treatment we should administer for the patient, because all are essential for bedside decision making. Next, please. Let us consider the most common questions we ask ourselves at bedside for using the cognitive shortcuts. When presented with a patient, clinicians usually must answer the following questions. First, what disease does our patient have? Second, shall we initiate any treatment for our patient? Or should we start some evaluation by testing the patient? So in this scenario, what we usually will be doing is we may use our cognitive shortcut to find the immediate solution for these problems. Next, please. So, what is heuristics? Heuristics is a cognitive shortcut where an intuitive understanding of the probabilities when combined with the cognitive process. That is heuristics. And the term heuristics was first coined in 1973 by Nobel Prize winning psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. They described heuristics as the rule of the thumb. Could be rule of the thumb, or it could be an educated guess, or it could be mental shortcut. Usually involves pattern recognition and rely on subconscious integration of patient data with the prior experience. Next, please. So the different shortcuts that we use involves availability heuristics, representative heuristic, anchoring, and adjustment heuristics. Availability heuristic usually deals with our immediate memory, the memory that is fresh in our mind that comes to us at bedside, and we may consider those possibilities for our patients. Representative heuristic indicates the typical case that is described in the textbook. For example, a patient with angina pectoris. So our patient with a retrosternal chest pain which is aggravated on effort radiating the left upper limb may be considered as an example of representative heuristic. And the third important heuristic is the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, where based on the prevalence of the condition and our experience and expertise, we may anchor one possibility as the first and foremost differential diagnosis. And as evaluation proceeds further, we gradually alter the possibility of the first diagnosis and come to a conclusion. Finally, the evaluation is finished. So anchoring and adjustment is a very important cognitive shortcut we routinely take up at bedside clinics. When we take up these shortcuts, next slide. Yeah. These cognitive shortcuts are associated with errors. One important error is the premature closure. That is, we jump into a conclusion and close all other evaluation with reference to that case. Second one is the confirmation bias. That is another type of error that may occur. Third one is the attribution errors. You attribute the condition of the patient without doing further evaluation. And the fourth one is the affective error. Because of the empathy towards the patient, you may postpone some important timely investigation. As a result of that, your diagnosis may not be able to be made at the appropriate time. So if you can correct these cognitive errors, then these cognitive shortcuts can be very useful at bedside. Next, please. I said a formulation of background questions and a foreign question. What is the background question? As you can see, this is the patient with a myocardial infarction. If you encounter a patient with a myocardial infarction, the background question usually involves what are the symptoms and signs of someone presenting with a myocardial infarction. What are the diagnostic tests that one may undertake in myocardial infarction? What are the causes of myocardial infarction? And what are the treatments of myocardial infarction? And we know we get this information from the standard textbook of medicine or from our teachers. With that background information, next, we start evaluating our patient. So when it comes to our patient, this particular individual, for us, in addition to the background question, we have to formulate the foreground question. That is the most important. The foreground question is actually dealing with our patient. the decision regarding his treatment, the action that we need to put into practice is based on the foreground question. For example, a patient with a myocardial infarction, the structure of the foreground question may have four components. The question is, in patients with myocardial infarction, does cholesterol lowering therapy compared to placebo reduce mortality? All of you realize the structure of the foreground question because this is the most important first step when you intend to practice evidence-based medicine. You can see there are four components. First one is the myocardial infarction patient population. Second one is the does cholesterol lowering therapy. Second, that deals with the intervention and compared. So there is a comparator compared to placebo. So you have patient population myocardial infarction, intervention cholesterol lowering therapy, comparison placebo, and the outcome is whether that will be able to reduce mortality related to myocardial infarction. So once you formulate that research question, go to the library and search for the lowering cholesterol lowering agents and see how successful is this particular cholesterol lowering agent in helping or reducing the mortality in my patient when compared to no treatment. Next slide, please. Now we start to learn few lessons on quantitative decision analysis. So we will take up or consider the subsequent slides. What is analytic decision making? What is meant by probability estimation and how it differs from odds ratio? We will find out how to pretest probability. We will also learn how to formulate a post-test probability once the patient is evaluated. We will find out what is the testing threshold beyond which we may not do further testing. We will also learn to see what is a treatment threshold and how this treatment threshold can be varied with relation to the condition of the patient and how we can use the currently available technologies to improve our decision making at the bedside. Next, please. So, what is analytic decision making? It is a structured quantitative analytical methodology. It is a better approach to decision making for, as Dr. Andrew said, for complex cases. For simple cases, it doesn't require much analytic technology. When you are confronted with a complex cases, analytic decision making is important. And usually, the usual pattern of recognition provides the most likely diagnostic possibility only. So analytic decision making, what does it do? It helps to quantify our diagnostic certainty with reference to that particular diagnosis. And what are the common analytic methods available to us? That include application of the principles of evidence-based medicine, use of clinical practice guidelines, which all of us are familiar, and also use of various specific quantitative techniques which we have to bear in mind. The most common is based on the Bayes theorem. Next, please. Now let us learn how to generate a pretest probability. In our routine clinical practice, we actually, after clinical examination, we generate a hypothesis. So it starts with the hypothesis generation. Hypothesis generation. Once the hypothesis, that the differential diagnosis that generated, we test the hypothesis. Diagnostic hypotheses are, after testing, either accepted or rejected. And usually it is done by a pattern recognition. And we know that the starting point for the differential diagnosis is the patient chief complaint. That is, for example, the myocardial infarction patient, it is a chest pain. We may also consider his basic demographic data along with the physical examination finding. Now you are in a position to estimate the pretest probability. How will you estimate the pretest probability? For each condition on the list of possibilities, ideally, you assign an estimated probability or likelihood of it being the correct diagnosis. How will you do that? So we should, next slide. So now we are dealing with estimation of probability. How will you estimate the probability of a disease? The probability of a disease in a patient is the frequency with which that disease or event occurs in the population. For example, the probability usually ranges from 0 to 1. 0 means impossible. 1 means 100% certain. So it is, when it is expressed as a percentage, it varies from 0 to 100. An example is, if a disease that occurs 2 out of 10 subjects has a probability of 2 by 10. 2 by 10. That is 0.2 or 20%. The probability is 20%. So that is probability. Next, we will go to the odds ratio. Next, please. Yeah. Estimation of odds ratio. Odds represents the ratio of affected to the unaffected. That is the ratio of the disease to no disease. A disease that occurs 2 out of 10 subjects has a probability of 2 by 10 has odds of 2 by 8. That is 0.25, often expressed as 1 to 4. We should remember that odds and probabilities can be converted to one to the other. The formula is odds is equal to probability divided by 1 by P, or probability is equal to odds divided by 1 plus probability. This slide is very important because when you are reviewing the literature, some of the articles, the probabilities will be described. Some other articles based on the study design, you will be seeing odds ratio. Next, we will consider a simple clinical scenario to learn more about pre-test probability and post-test probabilities. Consider a 50-year-old hypertensive diabetic patient with a history of chronic smoking presents with the chest pain and is evaluated at the emergency room, and the physician documents the following differential diagnosis: acute coronary syndrome, ST segment elevation MI, chest wall pain, dissecting aneurysm, pulmonary embolism, spontaneous pneumothorax. See, these are the differential diagnosis at that point in time. Now, the most important task that we are not routinely doing is putting into numbers. We may say highly probable, most likely, but here is a place where to estimate the pretest probability, you have to put in some numbers. Next slide, please. So this table shows the numbers. You can see in this situation, the pretest probability of acute coronary syndrome is 40%. ST segment elevation MI is 20%. Chest wall elevation is 30%. Pulmonary embolism only 5%. Dissecting aneurysm less than 3%. And spontaneous pneumothorax less than 2%. And this is our starting point. So with these numbers in our mind, we start evaluating the patient. How will we evaluate? In a suspected case of myocardial infarction, we evaluate the patient by ECG and X-ray. Next slide, please. So we have taken the X-ray and ECG, we find that both are normal. You further explore the patient history, you find that the patient gives a history of leg pain and swelling for the last few days. So this information, a normal chest X-ray with a normal ECG, our probability estimates for acute coronary syndrome, dissecting aneurysm, and pneumothorax comes down, and the probability of, all of you agree, pulmonary embolism goes up. Again, we have to estimate what is the probability estimates. Next slide, please. So with the post-test probability, that is additional finding of leg pain, swelling, and normal ECG and chest X-ray, our acute coronary syndrome
post-test probability comes down to 28, while pulmonary embolism possibility goes above from 5 to 50%. You understand? So, additional finding of leg pain, swelling, and a normal ECG and chest X-ray modify our pre-test probability of to post-test probability number 1, that is 28% for acute coronary syndrome and 50% for pulmonary embolism. Next, please. Now we will consider the post-test probability 2. The change in probability may lead to additional testing. Now we know X-ray is normal, patient has pain, the test, you evaluate him by Doppler and also ask for a chest CT angiography. That further test modifies the post-test probability and either confirm it or refute the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism that you can see in the next slide, please. Next table, please. Next. Yeah, you can see post-test probability 2 with the additional finding of segmented defect on chest CT angiography and a normal serum troponin level. The probability of pulmonary embolism in this case goes to 98%. The 98% estimate is very important because once that is there, you can confidently start treatment for that case. So what is this 98% probability? How you will arrive it, that is important. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the probability estimation and finding the testing threshold. All of us know a test should be done only if its results will affect the management of the patient. Always remember that. When disease pretest probability is above a certain threshold, treatment is warranted. That number you said 98%. Treatment is warranted. That is called the treatment threshold, and testing is no further testing is indicated. Below the treatment threshold, testing is indicated only when a positive test result would raise the post-test probability above the treatment threshold. So always treatment threshold is very important. The lowest pretest probability at which this can occur depends on the test characteristics and is termed testing threshold. So we should know the testing characteristics and also the testing threshold. Next, please. Probability estimates and treatment threshold. The disease probability at and above which treatment is given and no further testing is warranted is termed the treatment threshold. In the above hypothetical example of patient with chest pain, treatment threshold converges on a near certain diagnosis, that is 98% probability. Next, please. So in our clinical practice, how we set the treatment threshold. Usually, when the diagnosis is uncertain, the decision to treat must balance the benefit of treating a sick person against the risk of erroneously treating a well person or a person with a different disorder. As I said earlier, both financial and medical consequences are also important consideration. So to take into account both the likelihood of disease and the magnitude of benefit versus the risk. This balance determines where the clinician sets the treatment threshold. Next, please. So variation of treatment threshold. Risk of treatment is, the scenario is risk of treatment is low. If the benefit of treatment is very high and the risk of treatment is very low, example, giving a safe antibiotic to a patient with diabetes who possibly has a life-threatening infection. Usually, we clinicians tend to accept high diagnostic uncertainty and might initiate treatment even if probability of infection is fairly low. Next slide, please. That is a risk of treatment high and variation of treatment threshold. When risk of treatment is very high, for example, pneumonectomy for a suspected lung cancer, one might recommend treatment only when the probability of cancer is very high, perhaps more than 95%. So treatment threshold is the point at which the treatment of not treating is greater than the risk of treating. Next, please. As you can see here, the low risk for antibiotic administration suggests that selection of treatment threshold at 30% is okay. While pneumonectomy or suspected lung cancer suggests selecting a high treatment threshold. You understand? So the risk versus benefit, and based on that, you adjust the treatment threshold probability. Next, please. So whatever I said with regards to analytic decision making or quantitative decision making, it has got many limitations. But you should see that quantitative clinical decision making seems precise. If I say it is 95%, it is 95% for you also. If I say high probability, highly likely, then there may be some difference of opinion. We should see that in type of analytic decision making, many elements in calculations are often imprecisely known. That is the problem. And this methodology is difficult to use in all, but the most well-defined and studied clinical situations only. That is the main problem. Next, please. So, to minimize many such problems, technology is going to help us. As you can see in this slide, what are the newer developments and the technology slide 2015 to 2020, 2020 to 2025, 2025 to 2030, and 2030 to 2035. By 2030 to 2035, we hope that we will be able to develop a specialty called regenerative medicine, where we will be using quantum computing, brain interface, and bioprintings. Maybe there will be many digital avatars and wearable sensors, augmented virtual reality will be with us, electroceuticals with us, 3D printing technologies for drugs will be available. So with all these technologies at hand, maybe as time goes by, we will be able to make decisions with a lot of certainty. Next slide, please. So to summarize, generating evidence from research is a very important activity in clinical field. The generated evidence should be synthesized, and developing evidence-based clinical practice and policies is very important. Once that is developed, then you should see it should be applied properly and it should become the policies. So in the application of evidence-based medicine, the patient circumstances is important, the evidence is important, and moreover, the patient wish is also important, and that will lead to medical decision making in clinical medicine. Next, please. So I would like to conclude this session by saying that medicine is not an exact science, but a science of dealing with uncertainty. The challenge to physician is to provide up-to-date medical care. The ultimate goal of all of us is to help patients live long, functional, satisfying, and pain and symptom-free life. By adopting the principles of evidence-based medicine, it will be possible to maximize the benefits of scientific research for patient care. Next, please. So EBM is an approach to teaching the practice of medicine and improving decisions by individual physicians about individual patients. That all of us know. The problem is years of experience, unaccompanied by updating of knowledge, can result in decline of clinical performance. So as far as a clinician is concerned, you should see that his performance is the most, that is timely intervention implementation. His performance is the most important parameter that one should consider. And to improve that clinical parameters, knowledge updating is very important. The need for valid information about diagnosis, therapy, prognosis, and prevention in this era of consumer activism is highly essential to help not only the patient but the clinician also. Next, please. So I will summarize my conclusion by saying that medical educators and medical colleges have the singular responsibility of indoctrinating the principles of EBM as a concept, as a philosophy, as a religion, necessary for being efficient, compassionate, caring, and responsible clinician among the future generation of physicians during their formative years. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So I once again thank Dr. Andrews and the management for giving me an opportunity to present some of my beliefs and thoughts for the benefit of the young generation of clinicians. So if there is any questions and clarifications, I will be happy to
Thank you, sir, for the excellent talk. You have given an overview of evidence-based medicine and what is evidence-based medicine. That is according to the available evidence, expertise of the doctor and expectations of the patient. So you have shown us, as William Osler has said, I wonder how much little knowledge is needed to practice medicine. And at the same time, I wonder how much knowledge is needed to practice it at its own way. Just like that, sir has told us the importance of evidence-based medicine. Now the director of P.K. Das Institution is with me. I request the director to say a few words.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you, Sundravosh sir, for making the rather dry subject so interesting. I think medicine in theory is a science, but in practice it's an art. And those who have mastered the art of medicine have become great doctors. So thank you for sparing your valuable time to spend some time with the newer generation and imbibing them the knowledge that is required in the practice of medicine. Thank you very much, sir. Murli sir.
Thank you once again.
Sorry, sir. Can you hear, sir?
Yeah, yes, I can hear. Yeah.
Who, sir?
Murli sir.
Sir.
I congratulate Dr. Sudhir for an excellent lecture. I can honestly tell, if I have heard this lecture, maybe in the 70s, the head or tail of what you are talking today. All looking back, after 50 years of practice of medicine, how we are changing from every day. Or as an anecdotal experience of an individual on which decisions are made through the cutting edge where all statistical and other probabilities with the evidence generated is now being become more difficult with evaluation, because many of the results are new, but what we are doing, what is called as the working diagnosis when the patient revise every day when you take down, and new things are incorporated, and you see the result, and again you revise the diagnosis. What is I think, but he has very nicely put it in the form of a.
Thank you, Muralidharan sir. Thank you very much.
Any of the participants want to say something, please? All of you, please mute when, except the person who is talking.
Dr. Andrew, I may prefer a suggestion. You can get the feedback from the audience so that I can respond to their suggestions and clarifications.
If anybody has got any question, please put it in the chat box so that sir can answer. If there are no comments, we will conclude the session by thanking the chairman and managing trustee of PK Das Institutions, Advocate P. Krishnadas, Director of Operations, C.R. Krishnakumar, and all the faculty of PK Das Institutions, all the senior members, and all those who have attended the program. On behalf of them, I would like to express my sincere thanks to Ghosh sir for sparing his time and giving such an excellent talk. We expect that we'll be able to spend few more hours either on this topic, which is his, I think, his brainchild or his favorite topic, or any other topic of his interest. Thank you, sir. Thank you once more.
Thank you, sir. I will definitely cooperate with you further academics, if possible. Yes, sir.
Okay, sir. And we hope that you will be able to guide our postgraduates and faculty in research also. Because most of the doctors have got no statistical mind. People like you will be able to guide them also. Thank you, sir. Once more, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.